In terms of getting our heads around the potential of restarting some of Germany's recently closed reactors, how does that compare to Europe's recent struggles with building brand new reactors in terms of cost and schedule?
Let's compare the most easily to restart reactors in Germany, category 1, so Brockdorf or Emsland, to the best run nuclear new build in Europe, which was the Finnish EPR. It took a long while, but it was actually the cheapest of the EPRs. Took 17 years to build and did cost 11 billion euros. We can likely restore Brockdorf or Emsland to operation for a cost between 500 million and 1 billion euros within 2 years or less. A tenth, if not a 20th of the cost for a similar sized reactor.
Welcome back to Decouple. Today, I'm joined by Noah Rettberg, a physics laboratory technician and precision machinist from Germany, who happens to have been our official German correspondent over the last 4 years of Decouple's existence. Noah, it's been, I think, a good year since we've had you on, so welcome back.
Thank you for having me back on.
And today, I think we've got a really exciting topic. I've maybe given away the answer to this rhetorical question, but Noah, what if I told you there was a European country that could build nuclear and bring baseload nuclear online as fast as was done in the heyday of the 80s and 90s? Can you guess what country that might be? Do you think it's going to be a surprise to our listeners?
Yes, I think.
All right, well, let the goddamn cat out of the bag. What country is it?
It's a surprise because the greatest possibility to bring additional nuclear generating capacity onto the European grid, these opportunities right now are in Germany, where we have several reactors that are currently in a state of decommissioning, but can be brought back online in a short amount of time for a relatively low amount of money, and thus significantly strengthening the resilience of our European power grid.
All right, so rhetorical question over. We are going to be talking about Radiant Energy's new report called Restarting Germany's Reactors, Feasibility and Schedule. And again, just thinking about how much output could come online, before we dive into the report, let's just kind of get a quick summary. What are we talking about in terms of answering that question? Are we talking about like a Chinese level of deployment in terms, again, of bringing nuclear online?
If you put it relative to the size of a country, it's a greater than Chinese level of deployment. If you put it in like absolute term, it's similar to like the extremely successful Swedish deployment in the 1970s and early 1980s, but it's a little bit less than the German build-out that we saw in the 70s and 80s.
So part of why this report is intriguing to me is because in Ontario, we're in the midst of a major refurbishment program. We are refurbishing the reactors at Bruce, the largest operating nuclear station in the world, which will get us with some upscaling. Am I saying that right? Up rates is the word I'm looking for, up to about 7,000 megawatts at that site. The Darlington site, we're refurbishing all of our CANDU reactors there, and we've just added Pickering to the list. And when I sort of try and understand the potential for what could happen in Germany, if Ontario had made the dumb enough decision to shut down our nuclear fleet and we're starting from scratch, that's about 12 gigawatts of nuclear that we could bring online, and our refurbishments take about 3 years. So what are we talking about in Germany? Let's maybe go back in time a little bit and get a sense of what a nuclear powerhouse Germany was in its heyday.
So Germany got the right to use nuclear technologies in the 50s. And we started with a couple of research reactors. And then in 61, we got our first real power producing reactors. From there on, German electrical generating companies had German companies build nuclear power plants based on German designs for them. There was some help involved from American companies, Westinghouse helping with designing the pressurized water reactors, and General Electric helping with designing the boiling water reactors. But these reactors, especially the pressurized water reactors, these were very much German designs. These are not like the French reactors where they copied American reactors. These are German reactors. They are special in many ways. They have, for example, they have extremely well-built steam generators and primary circuits. They are effectively indestructible, which is actually a requirement by the German regulators. The standards to which we hold our primary circuit components, we call that Basissicherheit, is so that basically in normal operation there is nothing inside the reactor that can destroy these lines. Also, the steam generators, they were built to last significantly longer than in other Western nuclear power plants. We have the Borsel NPP in the Netherlands, which is a German design, and its steam generators are now over 50 years old, and despite a significant upgrade, there is no sign of them needing to be replaced. We also had significantly bigger and stronger containment buildings in our reactors. We also, from the start, built all our nuclear reactors with double containments. And we built our nuclear reactors in such a fashion that the containment building is large enough and that it features like a labyrinth-like structure in the interior that operators can enter the containment building and work and maintain the nuclear reactor while it is running. There are only 2 lines of nuclear reactors which can do this around the world. One are the German reactors and the other one are the CANDU reactors, where you can stand inside the reactor while it is running. And I once had the privilege and stand above the ISAR 2 reactor while it was in operation. And it's surprisingly quiet when you stand there and like 4 gigawatts of thermal power are roaring under you.
Okay, so you've given us some good tidbits in terms of the designs themselves. Germany at one point was 30% powered by nuclear, is that correct?
Yes. There was a huge drive to deploy nuclear power, especially in the south and in the north of Germany, where there wasn't any coal. So South German and North German politicians were very interested in deploying nuclear. West German politicians, where the coal came from, were not so much interested in it, but also the utilities were very much interested. The philosophy of German nuclear power was basically go as big as fast as you can. So in the early 70s, we got Biblis, which was at the time the largest nuclear power reactor, where German nuclear power reactors would significantly outsize their competitors in other countries. So rather than building like several reactors on one site, we used to build like one big reactor on a site, maybe build another one next to it. And we did that in several sites all over Germany. We deployed 25 gigawatts in less than 20 years. And we actually had a decent learning curve. We started out very good. And then as regulations tightened somewhat in the late 70s, prices and times for building nuclear power plants increased. And in the 80s, German engineering tightened their belt and they standardized nuclear construction. So we got the Convoy or Baulinie 80 reactors, in which we saw basically a Gen 3 nuclear reactor already in the 80s being built for a similar amount of money and a similar amount of time like we see currently in China.
Wow. So how big are we talking? How many megawatts output? You said, was it the largest nuclear reactor in the world at that time?
Biblis A, when it came into operation at 1,250 megawatt, was the largest reactor at the time. After that, this size was very economical, so German utilities stuck with it, going a little bit larger. So we got these reactors which had around 1,350 megawatts in the 80s, which later in the 90s and 2000s were uprated to above 1.4 gigawatt.
And, I think we'll have to refer listeners back to the archives for previous episodes. We really deep dive what happened in Germany in terms of what changed attitudes. Obviously, Chernobyl had an influence on that. But maybe just take, 2 or 3 minutes just to talk about, we had this impressive rapid build out. There was a strong economic rationale. There wasn't coal in the north and south, as you said. What shifted, I guess? Just give us the abbreviated version in terms of attitudes and the beginning of this call for an Atomausstieg or exit from atomic power.
So a call for an Atomausstieg started with the Green Movement, who opposed nuclear energy in every form, no matter whether military, civilian, power production, or medical isotopes. They flat out opposed it. And they started calling for it in the 70s, right as nuclear in Germany started growing rapidly. And at the time, there wasn't good reception of that in the politics, but that changed in the 80s. One of the reasons was that the Social Democrats ruled at the time, and the chancellor of the Social Democratic Party, Helmut Schmidt, he was extremely pro-nuclear. And when his coalition failed in 82, he became really unpopular in his own party, and so the pro-nuclear voices with him became unpopular. At the same time, the threat to the coal industry made the coal lobbies and the coal unions become partners of the green movement. So we see from the 80s and late 70s, we see these posters where like the Greens are pointing to their vision of like clean coal powering Germany in the post-nuclear future. This is happening at the same time. Then we see power consumption stops to rise in Germany. Before that, we had seen similar ways, like 7% per year rise in power consumption. And then in the late 80s, it stops, it halts. So power consumption is no longer rising, despite the GDP continuing to rise. And now we have an overcapacity on the German grid. So the desire for utilities to build really big, expensive nuclear power plants, which save money in form of fuel in the long run, this desire becomes very low. And rather they are looking into decommissioning older coal and gas power plants, and they are looking into getting the most of the capacity they already have and saving there. And we also have seen in the 80s some nuclear projects go out of whack. We have seen the Krümmel project, which took significantly longer than originally planned. It was planned to be completed in 6 years. It took over 9 years. And we also saw Mülheim-Kärlich, where basically, for a legal reason, the Green Movement got a fully built, up to spec Gen 3 nuclear power plant decommissioned after essentially a year of operation. Because the original plans, they thought we built it on a place, then they thought out this place, there was a fault line running under it. So they slightly moved the power plant to another site right next to it. But they didn't fill out the paperwork for that correctly, so then a judge banned the plant from operation, and the power plant was stuck in a legal hellhole from there. So after that, the desire in the utilities for more nuclear power soured. And also in politics, we saw the first state-level red-green coalitions, where like the Social Democrats and the Greens made it their purpose to make the operation of nuclear power plants as much expensive as possible, by tightening the regulatory ratchet, which that's so bad that even the German courts banned the red-green governments from even further tightening the regulatory ratchet, because they said it's not the purpose of the regulator to put through a phase-out. A phase-out has to put through by a legislative branch. And then in 89, a red-green coalition became the federal government, and then they banned nuclear power nationwide, with some exceptions. And these exceptions are that the existing nuclear power plant are allowed to continue to run until that and that date. But outside of these exceptions, the production of commercial nuclear power is forbidden.
Okay, so I hear there's something very interesting about this ban. It's potentially the most leaky nuclear ban in the world. Mark Nelson was describing it as such. Can you go through like what the wording actually is and what some of the workarounds could potentially be, particularly in this environment where we're talking about maybe restarting the German reactors?
Yes, the actual wording of the paragraph 7 of the Atomgesetz, the nuclear law in Germany, states that the permitting of commercial electrical production from nuclear energy will not be given. So there's no permit to produce electricity from nuclear power whatsoever, except for, and then it lists all these existing nuclear power plants and their due-by date. This is how the law is structured. And this is everything that bans nuclear power from Germany. There is nothing else prohibiting you from building and running a nuclear reactor producing a crap ton of electricity in Germany. So the way that this was worded is because it was easy to get this into the law. There were some agreements between the government and the utilities, so that the utilities would get these due-by dates, so that they can write off their existing power plants, and there would not be the utilities suing the government for financial compensation. But as a consequence, this law is very leaky, so you can theoretically work around that. You could, for example, say that you only using your reactor to sell commercial heat, that you say you want to sell your electricity non-commercially, or that maybe you say, oh, it's my own private reactor, I use it for my own private purposes, it only runs my company, so the electricity is not put onto the public grid and not sold commercially, which is of course something that will be tested in court, but there's not a definite ban to ban these reactors from operating. And there is still an existing regulator with regulatory rules which can allow you to run these reactors if you have maintained them properly.
That's fascinating. In terms of the timelines that were given for the plants to close then, these arbitrary dates that were chosen, were they arbitrary, or was it based upon having these utilities not sue the government for lost revenue? And so the sort of amortized life of the plant was considered in terms of when they'd be shut down?
Kind of both. For one thing, they were of course set in a way that they would be significantly in the future of the government that set them. So it would fight another government in the future, not themselves. And also there were additional 2 rules on like due-by dates and when the nuclear power plant has to be definitely shut down. There was a rule that the power plant could only produce this amount of power anymore. So like reactor would be given like 50 additional terawatt hours that it would generate. And also, for example, the utility RWE got 100 terawatt hours of production rights because its Mülheim-Kärlich nuclear power plant was shut in the early 90s and stayed shut in the 90s. And so in order to accept that the Mülheim-Kärlich nuclear power plant would never run again, RWE got these 100 terawatt hours. So there was like there were discussions between the utilities and the government. Actually, our current president, Germany has a head of state president. Our current president was the politician who negotiated the deal between the government and the utilities onto which nuclear power plant would get what amount of terawatt hours as allowance. And there was a rule that newer power plants could get transferred these allowances from the older power plants. So there was a desire to definitely have these power plants being shut down before they go into their late 30s of years. There was this idea that the older the nuclear power plant becomes, the more dangerous it becomes, which is something deeply ingrained in the anti-nuclear movement and which we know is completely wrong, because these plants get updated and they are essentially better when they are 40 than they were when they were brand new.
So again, before we get into this report and the talk of restarts and feasibility, to get a sense of that and to see how far along the fleet is in its decommissioning, what was the sort of pace at which reactors are being closed? When did they first start being closed? Did that pick up steam? I know after Fukushima, Angela Merkel reversed a position she had, which was actually to extend the time before shutdowns. Just help us understand that, so it gives us a framing for talking about restarts and which reactors might be more feasible to restart and when.
So the pace of decommissioning under the Schröder Atomausstieg was a little bit more linear, where you would see reactors dropping off one by one after another. And also, but with the hope that this would be speeded, that like in the older reactors could get a little bit longer life and the newer reactors would get longer life and the older reactors would shut down sooner. But actually before Fukushima, we saw barely any reactors shutting down. So the first one was Obrichheim in 2003. That was a tiny 300 megawatt reactor, the very first PWR in Germany. Didn't matter. Then came Stade in 2007, 700 megawatt reactor, which was significant loss. And then only did we see reactors shutting down in the early 10s. And we saw really strong efforts from the utilities to fight to keep their reactors running over the 2010 marker, because they knew there was an election coming in 2009, and back then they still had agency and didn't just blindly follow the orders of politics, where they said, we know there is an election coming. We know the conservatives and liberals are going to win this election lightly. If our reactors made it until that day, these parties can save us and can reverse the phase out. So they kept their plants running. They put nuclear power plants into and run them basically as peaker plants in order to make them use as little of their production allowance as possible. So you got like a plant like Neckar-Westheim 1, which was 600 megawatt PWR. It basically ramped down from 40% to 100% and back down to 40% every day.
Because it was given a certain number of terawatt hours before it had to shut down.
Yes, it had only like 10 terawatt hours left, and they knew we can't make it over 2010 with that terawatt hours if we run baseload. So we use the nuclear power plant as a peaker plant, and these early generation German PWRs and BWRs, they have insane load following capabilities. Really insane, like 11%, 12% of rated power per minute. It's like comparable to really fast acting gas plants. And then came in 2010, the Merkel government gave them a lifetime extension. In order, like they had a deal between the Merkel government and utilities. The utilities get to run their plants for around 10 years longer. And in return, the utilities agree to the government levying fuel tax on them, where like nuclear power almost became 50% more expensive overnight due to this fuel tax, where we had nuclear power making electricity for 2 cents per kilowatt hour, and after that was making electricity for 3 cents per kilowatt hour. And the reason why there was a deal for this, because it's actually unconstitutional. Later the utility sued, and then it was repealed. But then came 2011, and in a panic move, Merkel slashed the nuclear fleet. Every reactor built before 1980 was decommissioned immediately. And Krümmel, which was commissioned after 1980, was also decommissioned. So we saw a huge drop-off in the fleet right at 2011. Then over the 2010s, we only saw a handful of closures. And then in the early 2020s, we would see like 6 reactors going down in a matter of 1 year.
Right. The famous Save German 6, which you and I were marching in the streets of Berlin at the Brandenburg Gate with renowned climate scientist Dr. James Hansen to save. I mean, it sounds like the utilities have a strong incentive, or had a strong incentive, to keep these reactors going. Once they're paid off, they seem like they're really just money printing machines, even though they're being compensated very little for the electricity they're producing. A paid off nuclear plant produces power pretty darn cheap.
The nuclear power plant, yes, but the nuclear power plant suffered in the 2010s. Because we had a huge overcapacity on the German grid still, which got worsened by then electrical production consumption declining. And they compensated this because power prices in Germany were so low, so they exported a lot of power to our European neighbors. But this was only, they were only able to do this because power prices in Germany were in the 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour range. So if we have German nuclear power plants which made power for 3 cents per kilowatt hour, due to them having this fuel tax leveled on them, these nuclear power plants once stop being economical. They are making losses. So the utilities sued the government, saying the fuel taxes are unconstitutional. The Constitutional Court agreed with them, and the fuel taxes were put away in the middle of the decade. And then these power plants were still economical, but just scraping by because power prices in the 2010s were so low in Germany. But at the same time, we saw Energiewende happen in Germany, and we saw massively subsidized contracts for big wind and solar projects in Germany, which were much more lucrative than the actually firm power plants which were holding the grid on their shoulders. So the utilities were incentivized to abandon firm power capacity and go for renewables. We saw an influx of over 500 billion euros in a matter of 18 years in form of subsidies, which levied onto the consumer and then paid to the utilities and paid to everybody who had a solar plant on their roof as well. So renewables became artificially lucrative, and nuclear power was barely scraping by, partially due to fuel taxes.
Can you give us a sense? There's a great video from a conference with Václav Smil presenting, and he says, essentially Germany had about 100, she's making this right, 100 gigawatts of installed capacity, firm thermal before the Energiewende, added another 100 gigawatts of wind and solar, and then essentially had to maintain most of that thermal fleet for the famous Dunkelflaute. Is that in broad streaks accurate? I think that quote was probably from about 8 years ago. So I think even more wind and solar has been added. Give us a sense of the composition of the grid, sort of pre and post Energiewende, if we can say we're in a post Energiewende phase now or not.
So if we are going back to the 2000s, let's say go back to 2000, we had like 25 gigawatts of nuclear on the grid. And then, yes, probably around like 70 gigawatts of thermal capacity, coal, lignite, hard coal, gas, some oil capacity, and a tiny amount of water, hydropower. So this was the composition of a German grid in 2000. There were minuscule amounts of wind and solar already popping up back then, but the infection wasn't as bad as back then. And then in the 2000s, we saw the amount of renewables rise into the single digits of gigawatts with both wind and solar. And then in the 2010s, we saw this amount rise from the single digit of gigawatts into the medium and high double digits of gigawatts. And in 2020, we had 120 gigawatt of wind and solar on our grid, together with the remaining 8.5 gigawatts of nuclear, 40 gigawatts of coal, and 30 gigawatts of gas. So the coal and gas fleet basically stayed constant during the same time. Some older plants were scrapped, some newer plants were built. We saw some really massive 1 gigawatt coal power plants being built in the early 2000s. Some of them were actively promoted as the replacement to nuclear power plants. And yes, this was the state in the 2010s, where we had this good 100 gigawatts of renewable capacity, and then we had around 80 gigawatt of firm capacity. And this was the situation that Václav Smil described, that you have these renewables and then you have the thermal backup. But right now, this has gone completely out of balance, and we have significantly more renewables and significantly less thermal backup. We've lost the nuclear plant. We have decommissioned some coal plant, then brought them back during the energy crisis, now decommissioned them again. And right now, Germany doesn't have enough thermal capacity in order to meet peak demand. We are barely able to meet average demand with our firm capacity right now. And in times of high load, the German grid relies on importing up to 17 gigawatts of power from our neighbors. We had one such situation in November and in December, where we had a Dunkelflaute for around 2 weeks, and then in December for a couple of days, where the grid was pushed into its limit. And this even led to the CEO of the German utility RWE calling out this and saying, if this had happened in January, where wind and solar produced nothing, all the grids of our neighbors are stressed as well, because Dunkelflaute is a continental phenomenon. If this had happened in January, where demand is much higher, then we would have seen load shedding, we would have seen brownouts, we would have seen rolling blackouts, because we would not have been able to meet the load with the resources that we have on the grid.
Right. I mean, the weather gods have been somewhat merciful to Germany. I remember the winter of 2022-23 were quite mild. and what were gas reserves that I think Gazprom partially owned and had been kept quite low prior to the invasion of Ukraine, managed to squeak through that winter because it was a fairly mild winter. So once again, it seems like the Dunkelflaute struck at a favorable time for the German grid. But again, more and more alarms are going off here. Just very briefly,
Well, if you play Russian roulette often enough, at some point you will lose.
Right. Just briefly, this word Dunkelflaute, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but just explain what it means. It's you have a word for it. And we say doldrums of winter, I guess, but it doesn't kind of run off the tongue quite as well.
I've seen dark doldrum coming up in like the English discourse. Dunkelflaute has been existing in the discourse around renewables for a longer time, and was always this thing where like German media's promoted as, oh, it's just a myth. This doesn't happen. And everybody who has weather records available knows that this happens. And it happens roughly once per year, depending on how long you... So some say Dunkelflaute can be as short as a day, but the idea is basically that you have it going on for several days or a week. So the idea is that you have a week of no wind and solar only during the day, but because it's winter, there is barely any solar. And this happens roughly once per year, where you have like a week of no wind and barely any solar because it's winter. This can also happen like once per decade, where it's like an event that's almost like a month long. And this is something that, of course, makes a renewable-based energy system almost completely non-viable. Because you would need like weeks of storage capacity, which barely anyone has. Norway has weeks of storage capacity, has months of storage capacity actually, but only for Norway. So there was this idea that we could use like the Nordics as the battery of Europe, but which is completely farcical if you compare their storage capacity compared to the size of the European power grid. Even if you compare it only to the size of the German power grid, it's laughable. And we now see the Norwegians and the Swedes trying to shut us off and trying to cut power lines to Germany, to Denmark, to Germany, where we see 2 power lines built in the 70s, and the Norwegian government is now saying this is a gigawatt of capacity flowing from us to Germany when they need it and we need it as well. And we don't want to renew the license of this old power line. And also the Swedes have said we are not permitting the construction of a new power line running from Sweden to Germany until Germany fits its grid.
And Germany was a net exporter of electricity for many
years ago. Yes, we exported, I think, like 50 terawatt hours. Insane amounts of export because German power prices were so low. Our European neighbors couldn't compete, so we exported vast amounts of power to other countries in Europe. But right now, this has completely reversed. CO2 pricing has made the cost of our coal fleet significantly more expensive. Gas prices have gone through the roof, and the cheap nuclear is gone. So there is no potential for Germany to export, but there is huge need for Germany now to import whenever wind and solar is not producing, and it happens quite often.
So I think this is probably a decent amount of context. Again, folks should go back and look in the Decouple archives for past episodes with Noah to dive even deeper into this great summary we've had. But this, I think, is all framing very nicely this conversation about restart. So Radiant Energy, again, just released this report, restarting Germany's reactors. Tell me a little bit about the context in which that occurred. You've discussed, again, the broader European context. Some of Germany's neighbors are quite angry at it. Particularly, I think the Swedes have been quite vocal recently. Has there been talk within the German political class about this idea, this maybe taboo idea of having this incredible resource at their disposal, these nuclear reactors, or is there just not any insight into the fact that there are a number of German reactors that could be restarted quite quickly? I'm just trying to get a sense of why this report was commissioned. What was the context?
So the context is that the status quo around the political situation, the Atomausstieg, got toppled in 2022 when the Ukraine war started. And basically immediately discussion about reconsidering the phase out popped up. And then there was huge efforts undertaken by the Green Party, by also their friends in the German media, to shut down this discourse and state, no, this is too late, we can't bring these power plants back online, oh, we actually need gas and not electricity, so we just shut the power plants. But since the situation back then was very uncertain, very dire, the call for continuing to run these power plants grew ever more louder. And this then culminated in the Chancellor forcing Minister Habeck, who is the Minister of the Economy and Climate, so also responsible for energy, to say we are going to amend the phase-out law and allow these remaining 3 reactors to run for 3 more months until mid-April. We now know, due to leaked information, which were made available to the conservative-leaning German newspaper Cicero, that they were not leaked, they were made available due to an public inquiry, and the government was forced to hand them over. So in these documents, we now see that there was a strong effort by the Green-led Ministry of the Economy, which also does energy, to mislead the public, to commission fake studies, to make the cause for why we actually don't need these nuclear power plants while we need them. And we also know that there was an effort, both by Habeck, the minister, to basically give me stuff so I can justify that these power plants are being shut down at the end of the year. But there was also an effort made by the people working for him to even stop Habeck from questioning the phase-out. So there was huge pressure on Habeck from his own party, from his own people, to shut these power plants down. And we now know that when the Chancellor used his authority, which he has an authority to go to a minister and override them. And when the Chancellor did this and forced Habeck to allow these power plants to run, he did this not in order to force Habeck. Habeck was at the point very much in favor of running the power plants for 3 more months. But Habeck knew that he would lose a significant amount of political capital with his own people, and that he was under pressure from the Liberal coalition partner. So he himself conspired with Scholz, and he said, I want to do this, I can't be seen doing this, please force me to do this. And so the Chancellor did. And then we got to an extension of the lifetime for 3 months. This provided 4 gigawatts of power at the time when they were desperately needed. Also, the winter was mild. And then came 2023, the energy crisis somewhat became more manageable, and the pressure went away. For a while, it seemed like the Greens finally got their phase out as they wanted. But now in 2024, we are struggling with a sluggish economy, which is in mild recession. And for that reason, there are right now calls to alleviate one of the big problems that the German economy has, and that is high power prices. German economy has been very much used to low power prices in the 2010s. As I said, electricity was 2 to 3 cents per megawatt hour for 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour for large consumers. And gas prices were similarly very low due to Russian gas flowing in. Both of this is no longer the case. Gas is expensive, electricity is expensive. And right now, the German industry is very much struggling from that, among other reasons. And there are calls on the government to lower power prices for the industry. But the government has no tool in its quiver that can effectively lower the power prices within the technological limits they have set themselves. The only tool that they have available is continuing to further subsidize the power sector, and especially subsidizing the power hungry industry, which is something that won't go well for long. So at the same time, we have seen then calls from the conservatives to maybe look into whether this nuclear stuff, should we restart them? Though these were like sporadic efforts, also somewhat targeted at gaining political capital rather than actually returning nuclear power plants. Because if you want to return nuclear power plants as a conservative party, you're taking on responsibility. But if you just say, oh, these nuclear power plants are shut down because of the Greens, now we are suffering from the consequences, you can get political capital without any responsibility.
So my understanding is it might be the Christian Democrats. I might be getting the party wrong, but they actually said in a document or in a policy statement that there should be a report done on the possibility, the feasibility, again, maybe a trial balloon testing the waters, but the feasibility of restarting the reactors. It sounds like Radiant Energy Group jumped at this. It's not, been formally commissioned of them. To be clear, the German government nor any German party has paid for this. But we have this report. So I think this is a good time to to jump into it.
The timeline for that reasoning doesn't work because the idea for the Radiant report started in summer of 2024, and we started working really hard into that from then and got it finished by late November, a little bit later than we originally hoped. And right at the time when we were in our final phase of finishing the report, around then the conservative government put it into their party program that they are in favor of SMRs, that they are in favor of nuclear fusion, and they want to at least look into whether bringing the nuclear reactors back. If we had been a little bit faster, we would have beat them to that and we would have released the report before it. But it was very much being written at the time when they put that in their program, and we released immediately after it. Also, right before the Conservative Party put that into their party program, they did a testing the waters phase where over like 3 weeks, they publicly stated, oh, we need to look into bringing back nuclear power, we need to bring back nuclear power, with then, of course, the Greens and the Social Democrats pushing back on that. But from that, they apparently found the courage to at least bring this mildly pro-nuclear statement into their party program. And right at that moment, our report was released.
No, I mean, the timing is beautiful. And I think that really speaks to, advocacy efforts around the world to fluff the feathers of Canadians for Nuclear Energy. We started working on this call to refurbish the Pickering nuclear plant back in 2020. The facts on the ground at the time, energy demand looked flat. It was not, the utility had purchased gas plants to replace the output of the nuclear plant. And so there wasn't a strong economic rationale to do that. But we, persevered in this battle and wrote an excellent policy report. And it was waiting in the wings when the energy war occurred, when Russia invaded Ukraine. And there was even some ripple effects out to North America and gas prices in North America. And when, electricity demand forecasts started to go up, policymakers were looking for solutions, and waiting in the wings was our Save Pickering report. So it sounds like a very similar kind of timeline. Again, I think a good jump-off point for talking about this Radiant Energy report. So give us the skinny. This is looking at the reactors that are amenable to restart. I understand they've been classified. Tell the story however you want to, maybe in terms of how the report was crafted. I mean, it's an extraordinary document. It's very, very well researched. Very good intel here, I think, into the state of the reactors in Germany. But go ahead and take it away, Noah.
So what we did with the report, when we went into our research phase, we went to all the people that we know who are working in the German nuclear power plants in order to get a picture of what the situation in their respective nuclear power plant is. Because getting the information that you would need for such a report from just publicly available data isn't really possible. It depends on the reactor, it depends on the utility. Sometimes there is the data there, but often it isn't, and often you need this insider information, which is quite hard to get because the utilities don't want to get this information out there. And there is some pressure on the operators, on the workers in the plant to not talk about this publicly. This was even bigger in the past, where like Nuclearia did demonstrations in front of a nuclear power plant, and its workers were ordered to not attend our demonstration in favor of their own workplace. And this has somewhat subsided. We now have much more relationships with these workers, but still, all these people, they said we can never be quoted on this publicly with our name, because otherwise we could face consequences. So we needed to get this information done, and we could not say their names publicly. But you have my name under it. I did a lot of talking with these workers in nuclear power plants, so you have me holding my head up for it when these workers can't. But they provided a lot of good information, and we put this information together, and we had to ask ourselves, how do we present this information? Because an Excel sheet where all the reactors with all the stages of decommissioning, the parts that have been ripped out or haven't been ripped out, nobody is going to read this except a handful of nerds. So we needed a system to bring this information to people, especially to people who are not that well informed about nuclear technology. So I came up with a system of classifying the reactors in 4 different classes of restartability, with the first class being reactors which are basically just shut down, but not a lot of decommissioning activity has been taking place. So we're talking about reactors which can be returned in like a good year with minor repair work and just a regular maintenance outage and a refueling outage. And then we have the class 2, where significant parts of the nuclear power plant has already been torn apart. This could be a turbine, a generator, could be a primary loop line, could be a steam line, could be a main circulation pump. These are all parts which have been decommissioned in these power plants, though there is no firm order where like the first thing we do in every power plant is take the generator out. No, there are power plants where the first thing they took out are the generators in the turbine hall. And there are power plants where the first thing they take out are the main circulation pumps. So it's different things in different power plants that have to be replaced. So then we got this classification scheme with class 1 can be quickly restarted, class 2 need a couple more years and repair work, somewhat similar to what you have done in Pickering and need to be doing again in Pickering. And then we have category 3, where like we have still this impressive building where we could install a new reactor. For example, in like a building for German pressurized water reactors, we could install EPR, which is very similar to the German reactors. Basically, the internals of the EPR are of German heritage. And then we have category 4, or class 4, where basically the containment building is no longer worth saving, but we can still reuse the site for the power plants. And we have also put up a chart where we have put little icons there for each individual part of the reactor, not part, but like roughly part. So we have like the reactor vessel, the containment building, the primary circuit, the turbine, where we say these parts of the reactor, of the power plant are still there or are partially damaged. For example, if the main circulation pumps are missing, then we count the primary circuit as damaged, and then there are gradients to which degree these parts are damaged. And you can see that for all of the category 1 and 2 reactors, which parts are damaged, which parts need replacement.
To put it in North American terms, it sounds like your category 1s are kind of like 3 Mile Island restarts, where 3 Mile Island's been offline for about 5 years. There's some work that needs to go into it, but it can be restarted. Maybe category 2 is like Palisades, where there's more significant repairs and maybe steam generators that need replaced. Does that make sense, or is that a kind of an accurate way to think about it?
To a degree, though we don't need to replace any steam generators. The steam generators are fine. So actually the hardest to replace equipment is actually still there. what needs to be replaced are smaller components.
So give us a sense of how many gigawatts are in, I guess, at least the first, 1 and 2 categories, and how quickly they could come online. At the beginning of the episode, we said that this addition of clean, firm baseload power could be as quick as, some of the countries with the most envious deployments of clean energy in world history, such as Sweden's rapid build out in terms of, again, of addition of clean energy on a per capita basis. Give us a sense of the numbers and the kind of scale and pace that we could see.
We have 9 reactors in these category 1 and 2. They are all in the range between 1.3 and 1.4 gigawatt of net electrical power. So together they have 12 gigawatts of net electrical power. When we talk about recommissioning these and refurbishing these nuclear power plants, we could also talk about, in the process, just like you did in Bruce, operating these nuclear power plants. There's still in many of them capacity to operate, especially if we are committing to actually working in a significant manner on the primary circuit of the reactor. Then there is an even greater amount of capacity upgrades that we can go for. So I would say between these 2 reactors, accounting for upgrades, we have 12.5, if not 13 gigawatt of net electrical power, which can be brought back onto the German grid within 8 years or less, with at least 4 gigawatts coming online in 3 or 4 years.
I want to talk briefly about the cost of decommissioning versus the cost of refurbishing these reactors in category 1 and 2. The Pickering decommissioning budget, I believe, was about $7 billion. We had a rather interestingly named office that opened up in Pickering when the decommissioning looked like a sure thing. It was called the Office for Canadian Nuclear Sustainability, which we all thought was Orwellian because they were actually planning on decommissioning 1/4 of Canada's nuclear capacity. But in any case, I mean, major investment to decommission. And our argument was always, let's take that money, put it into refurbishment, and we can, make the decommissioning fund even larger with another 30, 40 years of operation. How do those economics compare, decommissioning versus restarts and refurbishment?
So German law requires utilities to hold significant funds in reserve for the decommissioning work. And since these are very conservatively managed funds, so these are funds where we see both through interest and positive developments in the stock market, there are amounts of capital raised even larger than the capital put into by the utilities in the first place. Each utility needs to have one of these, fund of these. In addition, there is a fund for all the utilities where all the utilities paid into for the waste disposal facility. So the waste disposal facility fund has around 24 billion euros right now in it. And the waste disposal fund and all the decommissioning fund together have 38 billion euros in them. And for example, the biggest nuclear electricity in Germany is the Prussian electricity company. It has a 7 billion euro fund for the decommissioning of its reactors, which according to the regulatory office is significant enough in order to pay for the decommissioning process of all its reactors. And we are talking about, for the whole decommissioning process, a good billion will be spent on decommissioning one of these reactors. And the recommissioning cost depends on the status of the reactors. This is something that we will continue to look in further, but we roughly estimate that for a category 1 reactor, it will cost 500 million to recommission them, since there is barely any work that needs to be done. For a category 2 reactor, we have parts that are already stripped out. It will cost between 1 billion and 3 billion euros to recommission one of these giant reactors.
So just compare that cost of, again, restarting a 1.4 gigawatt reactor. That's pretty close, a little bit less than a modern EPR, to the cost of, say, Flamanville or Hinkley Point C or Olkiluoto, just in terms of that value proposition of how little money you could spend to essentially get a new EPR's worth of electricity onto the grid in a year or two.
The EPR in Finland, which was actually the least expensive of them all, or at least the least expensive European one, the Chinese ones were cheaper, costed, I think, 11 billion euros for a 1.6 gigawatt power plant. The EPR in Flamanville costed 19 billion euros for 1.6 gigawatt reactor. And the two reactors at Hinkley Point will cost in excess of 30 billion euros, or is it pound? I think in excess of 30 billion pounds, so a little bit more even, for 3.2 gigawatt of power. All of the reactors that we could restart in Germany, I don't think that they will together cost more than 20 billion euros to recommission. So for less money than Flamanville or Hinkley Point C, we can get a fleet back online which produces several times as much power as they do.
Wow. So again, the cost of recommissioning a Category 1 reactor versus Olkiluoto is
laughable. It's like the cost of building a very small gas plant.
So again, there's this perception that unlike fine wine that gets better with age, that these nuclear plants get worse with age. We know with uprates and maintenance and addition of new pumps and components that often these reactors get better with age. What kind of lifetimes are we looking at? I understand reactors in the U.S. are getting licensed out to 80 years even. These German reactors, if we do a restart, say ISAR 2, I believe, one of the last of the German 6, how many more years do you think you can get out of that reactor?
Depends. Could maybe outlive me.
Well, we hope you have a long and prosperous life, Noah. But
I do as well, and I do as well hope that ISAR outlives me still. The question will always be, can we change the reactor pressure vessel? If we can change that, then there is no reason for the power plant not living for over hundreds of years, except that maybe better, cheaper reactors would be available in the future. But just from a technical point, if we can change the reactor pressure vessel, this power plant can run for hundreds of years. I'm very much on the Mark Nelsonian philosophy right here. But if we do not consider this an option and we say, no, the reactor pressure vessel can't be replaced, so the steam generators in these reactors, they will have probably 20 years at least of continued operation in them, maybe longer, except in the Neckar-Westheim plant, which it has issues with the steam generators. They will only last for like 15 more years. Though replacing the steam generator is absolutely possible, and since these are very generously proportioned German reactors, you don't even have to cut into the containment building to remove the steam generators. There's a big opening in the side of it through which the steam generators can be moved in and out of the reactor building. So replacing steam generators, even though they haven't done it, should actually be easier than in, for example, an American or French reactor, because the reactor is so much more accessible for large components going inside and outside. Or the other parts, main circulation pumps can be replaced, loop lines can be replaced, the steam lines can be replaced, instrumentation can be replaced. Everything in there can be replaced, or is at least in a state where it can run for 20 more years if they haven't cut it apart already.
Do you think there's any possibility politically for a new German coalition government to say, okay, we are going to put a freeze on all decommissioning activities until we get a chance to reevaluate this? I want to get a sense from you of how quickly these decommissioning activities are proceeding. Andreas Fixter, if I'm saying his name correctly, I think I'm not, famously climbed a cooling tower and suspended himself there on climbing equipment to try and delay the demolition of a cooling tower, I believe, at one of the plants that was being decommissioned. That's, I think, a very vivid illustration of the kind of actions that are being taken by a few courageous activists in Germany. But give us again a sense of the decommissioning, how quickly it's going, and again, whether this would be a sort of, we're talking about political trial balloons from these political parties. Would some kind of a statement like that we're going to halt decommissioning activities until we get a chance to really give a look at this radiant energy report, for instance?
The decommissioning is taking a quite fast pace right now, especially in states where the government is pro-nuclear, funnily enough. There's this idea that, of course, the Greens are interested in getting these power plants scrapped as fast as possible, but actually no, in the north, in Schleswig-Holstein and in Niedersachsen, where we see the Green parties running the Ministry of the Environment and with it the state regulator, the decommissioning process is taking a long time. And in the south, where the Conservative Party, the Conservative Party rules Bavaria, the Bavarian state regulator actually is very fast with permitting taking apart individual components of the reactor. And for that reason, for example, the ISAR-2 reactor, which was one of the last to be shut down, is actually in these category 2 reactors and not in the category 1 reactors, and it's quite advanced in its decommissioning process, though not irreversibly lost. They have damaged the main circulation pump, they have ripped out instrumentation on the reactor for the control rod drives, and they have ripped apart the steam lines. So there needs to be significant work done. Significant damage has been done in only a year. So, but still, that plant isn't lost for quite some time. It's more expensive to bring it back online. Until it will be finally lost will take still some more years. There is the possibility of changing the political situation in Germany right now. Right on this day where we're recording, something really unprecedented has been taking place in German politics, because the Liberal Party, which dropped out of the coalition and is now opposition, and the AfD party, the second largest party in the opposition, has agreed to a proposed law brought into the Bundestag by the Conservative, the leading opposition party, and now a law on immigration policy. And now the Bundestag has agreed to that law. Something like that has never done in German politics, even though the parliament is the sole authority on what laws can pass and can pass any law at once, no matter what the actual government wants. This has not been taken part historically, and it has, especially, this is unprecedented because the AfD party, the far-right party, is a pariah in the German political landscape for, I think, good reason, though this makes actually changing the German political situation difficult, because this benefits the Social Democrats and the Greens greatly, because this pariah position of the far-right party doesn't allow for the formation of any conservative government coalition without left-wing political parties. And this has now opened the door for example, a conservative liberal minority government, which can go to both the Social Democrats and the far right and the Greens and say, we need additional votes for our law. This is a good law. If you don't give the votes to us, we can go to another party to give the votes to us. And this, I think, significantly changes the political landscape in Germany. And this makes the chances of like a ban on decommissioning and a ban on and lifting the ban on the commercial production of electrical power from nuclear energy, this can now be a reality, and it can be a reality basically next week, assuming that you convince the Conservative Party to propose such a bill in the parliament.
The pace of decommissioning you mentioned is going quite quickly in the, ironically, the more pro-nuclear parts of the country, where the conservatives are in power at the state level. Are the utilities also interested in decommissioning quickly? Part of me thinks that, if you allow radioisotopes to decay, it's safer to work. If, I think our plant in Ontario with the Pickering A reactors is to let them sit for a good 20 years, let them cool off, to make the decommissioning work early. Do the utilities want to move slowly, or do they want to move quickly on decommissioning?
The utilities want to move quickly. If you wait for radioactivity to decay so that decommissioning is much more easy, you need to wait for a really long time. And by German law, this means continuing to operate the reactor for a really long time. If you keep the reactor as is, you need to still operate it. It just can't make power.
What does that mean to operate it?
That means that the staff still has to go out every day, keep all the systems in running order, check all the parameters of the reactor, have everything sitting there like a reactor at idle. It's essentially a defueled reactor at idle for 20 years. And that is just way too expensive. You can't just mothball it for 20 years and then do it. You need to keep it in an operational status for 20 years if you would do it like you do in Pickering. And there's no way the utilities are going to pay for that. So what they are doing is they are doing a decontamination process where they wash out the reactor in order to remove a significant amount of the activity inside the reactor. And then they want to start ripping it apart as fast as possible. They have the technology to rip apart a reactor as fast as possible. And this is what their utilities are going for, because it's now a money-losing asset. It loses them money. Until the reactor is completely gone, every part that isn't removed needs to be kept in operational order. And this costs them a significant amount of money. And they are very much incentivized to move forward. And in the parts of Germany where the utilities have the best relationships with the regulators, where the regulators is the least anti-nuclear, in these parts of Germany, the decommissioning process is right now taking the fastest pace.
And so the term we use here is kind of mothballing the reactor. Is what you're describing in Germany unique in terms of keeping those systems, essentially operating the reactor defueled, in terms of driving up those costs of decommissioning? Is that unique to Germany, or am I misunderstanding maybe what's been happening in Canada with some of our reactors that we've laid up, for instance, for a decade?
To a degree. I mean, I've seen similar approaches to decommissioning being undertaken in other countries, and in Britain, most extremely, they are mothballing the reactors for 100 years, and only then they are going to rip it apart. So it depends, but we've also seen similar situation in other countries. For example, the Zion nuclear power plant in America has been also ripped apart extremely rapidly, just like the German reactors. So it's completely uniquely, but you don't see this in every country that decommissions nuclear power plants.
I guess what I'm referring to is that extraordinary cost of maintaining 300-400 people on site to keep that reactor, as you mentioned, operable. Is that unique to Germany in terms of being a pressure that's leading to rapid decommissioning?
Just
that is unique.
Look at Indian Point, which they are also ripping apart very quickly. I've asked our American friends, can we restore Indian Point, looking at restoring German power plants, and their answer has been no. So they are ripping apart the reactor very fast. And I've also been told that the staff at Indian Point has largely been laid off. And this has not been the case in the German nuclear power plants. The staff is still there, still getting paid.
Wow.
The staff has been decreasing for a long while since they stopped hiring new people, and still decreasing as older people drop out as they are retiring. But it's not, the operational staff in Germany isn't gone in these reactors. It's just a little bit declined.
Interesting. Very much a breaking story. A lot's going on. I mean, it's a very exciting drama to watch from the outside. A nail biter in terms of...
And the drama will only get more intense. We didn't commission the Radiant report in order to have fun. The Radiant report was commissioned because Radiant wants to significantly revisit the German theater of global nuclear activism. And we do intend to revert the German Atomausstieg. We are in this battle in order to win this battle. And for that reason, we will be having a conference where we will discuss the technical and political realities of the chances of bringing nuclear back to Germany with our existing nuclear reactors. And that conference will be held at the end of April in Berlin.
What would be the significance of ending the Automatik and bringing Germany's nuclear reactors back online just politically? Germany is a hotbed of anti-nuclear activism, not just in terms of its civil society, but also, I think, in terms of its formal government positions, as I've seen personally at the climate conferences I've been at, where the Germans seem to always be facilitating countrywide coalitions of anti-nuclear nations to try and stall or to speed up phase outs of nuclear.
Reverting the Atomausstieg means marching your army directly into Mordor and defeating Sauron in Mordor. It means defeating the anti-nuclear movement in what has become its heartland. The German state directly funded global anti-nuclear activism out of state coffers during the Merkel and now especially during the Scholz government, or the Scholz-Habeck government would probably be more accurate. And if we revert the German Atomausstieg, this isn't just this will not bring the operation of a couple more reactors in Germany, which will have significant impact on the European electricity mix, but it will also extremely weaken the German anti-nuclear movement politically. It has already been weakened in the past by losing members, partially due to biological issues. But one of their biggest holds onto power is the institutionalized anti-nuclear movement. It's all the people who have risen through the ranks of the German state apparatus and now sit in all these regulatory offices. And as we are going to recommission German nuclear power plants, these people will be forced out. Because these people who were in a very nice situation for themselves, where they could manage the decline of an industry that they hated, they will now be ordered to properly regulate an industry that needs to thrive and that has permission to thrive from politics. And they can either say we are fine with that and we are doing our job properly, or they can try to throw sticks and rocks in its way. And this won't go good for them. We have already seen one of the leading green lobbyists who Robert Habeck put into a state position, Patrick Greichen, being removed from office after this becoming quite a scandal. We have a chance into getting rid of the institutionalized anti-nuclear movement in Germany. We have a chance of bringing 12 to 13 gigawatts of power back onto the European grid quickly. And we have a chance of taking away a significant amount of funding of the global anti-nuclear movement, which it gets from the German state coffers.
Well, that sounds like a call to action to me, Noah.
Yes, this is not just my battle, not just our battle. If you are in favor of global nuclear energy, this is your battle as well. We are all in this. And I would be honored and I would be very happy if you could reach out to us, could reach out to Radiant, could reach out to Nuclearia, and could reach out to me if you want to know how you can help us, how we can get together, how we can bring back nuclear back to Germany.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, again, I think in closing, it's just extraordinary to me when you run the numbers that Germany could bring basically an EPR worth of nuclear electricity onto the grid for 1/20th the cost of a EPR build that's occurring right now, if we want to kind of average numbers of Flamanville, of Hinkley
In less
Point.
than half the time it takes to build an EPR.
Well, I mean, for the category A's, you're saying it could be in 1 year.
A good year.
Yes. Okay, so let's say 2 years. In 2 years, for 1/20th the price, you can have essentially a nuclear plant that operates as well as a brand new one, maybe even better, on the grid, if we can reverse these
Yes,
laws.
very much.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. A call to action there, folks. If you are listeners, do get in touch. You can reach out to Decouple as well. We will put you in touch with Noah. We'll put contact information in the show notes as well. Noah, thanks again for coming on. It's been a good long time. Hope to have you back again soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And I wish to be back on soon as well.
Cheers.